Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to the Flower Lounge. I am so thrilled for this week's guest. She's been a heroine of mine for many, many years, and I have so many of her books, and I just adore her, and I know you will too. So let me give you the scoop. Rosemary Gladstar. We are so lucky to have her here. She is literally a star figure in the field of modern herbalism, internationally renowned in the global herbalist community. She's been practicing, living, learning, teaching, and writing about herbs for over 40 years. Considered a pioneer in the herbal movement, she has been called the Godmother of American Herbalism. And I would also add here that in other countries like Taiwan, Rosemary Gladstar would most definitely be considered a national treasure. And in terms of her background, she opened up her herb shop, Rosemary's Garden, in Sonoma County, California in 1972. She started, that was before I was born. She only a few years. She started developing herbal formulas. This is just to show you like how totally ahead of the curve she was. And she was co-founder of the Traditional Medicinal Tea Company. She founded and directed the California School of Herbal Studies, oldest running herb schools in the U.S. And she also was the founder and former director of the International Herb Symposium, one of the most esteemed herbal symposiums of the country. And in its 27th year now is the annual New England Women's Herbal Conference. Highly recommended. I'm going to be there next summer. Rosemary is a prolific writer. She's authored 11 books, and having written only just one book myself, I know how much work that is. 11 books on herbalism, including the best-selling Medicinal Herbs, A Beginner's Guide, The Herbal Healing for Women, which is such a great reference book, Herbal Recipes for Vibrant Well-Being, and The Science and Art of Herbalism, a popular home study course that has students from all over the world. She's a gifted and beloved teacher. Rosemary has taught in backyards, local events, international herb conferences, colleges, universities, hospitals. She's written for magazines, TV, radio. I mean, it's like endless what this woman has done for the healing gospel of plants. And she is also the founder of the Plant Lovers Journeys and has led incredible herbal travel adventures worldwide to places like Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Mexico, Greece, Switzerland, Ecuador, Italy, Provence, Patagonia, and Ireland. Oh my God. Her greatest passion has been the work of the United Plant Savers, and she's really passionate about saving and protecting at-risk North American medicinal plants. So she is, in my view, the embodiment of Mother Earth and, everything that has to do with the protection and proliferation of the preciousness of this beautiful planet that we live on. And along with all of these other things that we've mentioned, she lives and works from her home Sage Mountain Herbal Retreat Center, a 500-acre botanical preserve in central Vermont. So thank you so much, Rosemary, for being here. I'm so honored.
Thank you, Katie. I'm honored. I love that you weren't born yet when I opened my herb store. I think that's so sweet.
You were really ahead of your time. And yeah, well, there's a lot to dig in.
It's really, really
old. No, my God, you look so vibrant. Oh my gosh, if you're listening on the podcast, you have to go to YouTube and see Rosemary's face because I can't get over how vibrant and beautiful she is. Really, really, really. I wanted to start out with this really quick exercise that we always start out with, and that is to close your eyes and think about a time in your childhood when you played around flowers or plants or trees. Just reflect on what you were doing and who you were with. And if I were to ask you what would be like a favorite flower, or which flower, plant, or tree pops into your mind first, and then reflecting on if you could describe its personality in 3 words, how you would describe it. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes, and if you could just share about what you were thinking about and the 3 words you would use to describe it.
Well, it's me. You want me to answer that?
Absolutely. You are the star of the show.
Oh, mine's violet, actually. The little woodland violet. And the 3 words would be joyful, vibrant, and healing.
Wow.
It's my very first dream I ever remember having I was about 4 or 5. And I will remember that dream all my life. And it was about violets.
Really? Wow. That's so interesting. What we typically find is that the way people describe their childhood flower is usually the way in which they bring their greatest gifts to the world. So I would say that's totally accurate. Joyful, vibrant, and healing.
Great. Oh, that's nice.
So when you talk about your dream about violets, like that's literally like the first dream you can remember as a young child?
Yes, I remember that dream distinctly, like I had it yesterday. As my very first dream. It actually it's been an important dream for me my whole life. So I was in my dream, I'm very young when I had this dream. I couldn't have been any older than 4 or 5 years old. And I'm in my dream, I'm running, it's a misty, dusky type of evening. And I'm running through a field of violets. I'm running ecstatically with this and running towards something like I've found home, like I've come home. And I just remember it was beautiful and there were trees all around and this sense of mystery and like the sense, oh, I found home. Yeah, and it's been a remarkable dream for me. I came home. Yeah.
Wow. It's such a young age, like coming home to planet, just coming home to the earth. Wow. Yeah. So there's so many things I want to ask you, and just like, oh, well, where do we start? Some of the questions I have, and then we can just sort of like take this where it leads us, but everything from what some of your favorite plants and herbs are, to how you communicate with plants and flowers, to the way that herbalism has changed in your lifetime in terms of how it's being received and why you're particularly interested in empowering women with herbs. Maybe that's a good starting point wherever you want to jump off of.
Is there any place in particular? There's a lot of jumping off places there.
Okay, let's see. Let's start with how you communicate with plants.
So I feel that plants have many ways that they communicate with each of us. They strive all the time to be in communication with us. I feel that. And so they have lots of different ways. And for me, there's many ways. Like sometimes it's just simply I'm walking through the fields, and if I'm not paying attention, they grab me either by just a sound or by the wind or by something very beautiful that catches my eye. So a lot of the communication is nonverbal, but it's as clear and vibrant as a language that I understand. Stephen Brunner talks a lot about the lost language of plants, but he's such a brilliant writer, yeah, and he's done so much deep work with the plant spirits, but I actually don't feel it's really a lost language. I think it's just a forgotten language. And so it's about us paying attention to the very many ways that they want to communicate with us. So for me, the communication just happens. It comes through a sense of awareness. If I'm not paying attention, they get my attention. As I said, sometimes it's just the way they wave at me or the way the wind is whistling through the branches, and I actually begin to pay attention. Once I'm in that place of paying attention, the communication happens. It just kind of effortlessly. And I think it happens for everybody. I think that it's not something that's unique or rare for one person or over another. Mm-hmm. I do think that what we put our attention in, we're going to be better at. So learning languages, the more you learn to communicate with the plants, the more we're able to hear, the more they're willing to reach out. I have had a few times in my life, I've actually had them communicate to me with such a strong message that it was in English, so that I think it's difficult for plants to manifest to shapeshift either their language so that it's in English or French or some language that we actually understand, or in a form that we see. I think it's easier for them if we're more attentive and more aware. But there was a few times in my life where the message was so strong and so clear. So one was, I've told this story many times, you've probably heard it, but one was when I began my work with United Plant Savers in plant conservation. It's been about 25 or 26 years ago. And I was actually walking in my woods, just going out on a stroll, and I really heard the plants kind of screaming at me, you know, you need to plant us back. We're not here in abundant populations. And it was like that. It was this really clear message. I went, yo, who just said that? So that's happened to me. It's like, you know, who is speaking that? And that's always kind of startling. It kind of really does get my attention. Usually when it comes through that strongly, I know that it takes a lot of effort. It would be like me all of a sudden trying to speak in Russian or something, you know, it would just be impossible. It'd be like a magical moment that those words would come out. So for me, mostly I try to be much more attuned and aware so that they don't have to struggle so hard to be heard. When I do get a message like that, I absolutely stop in my tracks and really pay attention. And I did that day. I heard really clearly what they were saying. And I did start that project of replanting and trying to bring that voice of plant conservation and the awareness of where all of these plants that we were using, to really look at where they were coming from and to address that as a primary concern. So yeah, I'm trying to think of other times that they've just jumped out and, you know, just spoken that, but that time comes to me really clearly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good part. So yeah, and you know, there's a lot of techniques, like thankfully there's many herbalists today who are focusing their work on the more spiritual relationship with plants. So healing, yes, but healing the soul and maybe more than physical ailments, you know, like addressing that, the hungry, yearning soul that we have. And so, you know, people like Pam Montgomery and Stephen Buhner and Elliot Cowan, there's lots of people today who are doing that work and writing books. And they develop techniques actually that are pretty common. And there's a familiarity with a lot of overlaps with them about, mm-hmm. you know, slowing down and meditating and drawing the plants and, you know, mm-hmm. observing them physically and maybe writing about them and then asking responsibly what the plant wants you to do for it and what it can do for you. Mm-hmm. And those are beautiful techniques that help to train people who aren't used to this process that it's unfamiliar with. But quite honestly, what I found, all of those techniques are beautiful and I encourage people to do them. But what I found, that plants themselves are such powerful teachers that just by spending time with them, by being aware of them, that those plants' messages and their very teachings come through. So, you know, even if you're not even working, like say out in the gardens or in your meadows or field, but if you're down in your apothecary, even with these herbs that are in jars, this may seem almost impossible to believe, but the energy is so strong in those plants that, you know, as you work with those plants and you make medicines with them and you're making your tinctures and salves, those plants begin a communication. And if you're at all paying attention, you're going to get it. So mm-hmm. I think I would say to people, you know, learn those techniques. They're beautiful. And anything that helps us further on this path that we strayed so far from is helpful. But really, even just spending time in nature and hiking and gardening and paying attention to the plants when you're doing it, you'll begin that relationship of communication with the plants.
Yeah, I've often heard herbalism students say that they're sort of shocked because they get into the field thinking, well, I'm going to learn about herbs so I can help my family and my community. And then suddenly their lives take this radical shift and transformation. And they're actually able to sense that just simply by being introduced to the world of herbalism and plants, that their whole lives transform. And, you know, obviously I've seen similar things occur when people just start using tinctures and flower essences and teas. And it's so fascinating that it can be so effortless. And, you know, I wondered, since you are the godmother of American herbalism, if there's anything, yes, own it. If there's anything that you want to add about, like, you know, for example, you go into the woods and you see a particular plant, you may have read in books, it does this, this, this. And then there's also the doctrine of signatures and observing and communicating with the plant. And then your own experience of working with the herbs. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, you've been at this for decades. What are some of the most powerful ways or useful, practical ways that you're using in your own life to really dive deeply into the world of healing plants?
Yeah. You know, I just want to diverge just a little bit to just mention that the doctrine of signatures is really, in many ways, just the ancient plant-spirit communication. You know, that was the old language for it. Like, people sometimes think it's antiquated and outdated, but really almost everything that was discerned through the doctrine of signatures holds true both scientifically, through vigorous and rigorous scientific studies, and also with modern research. And really when I look at it, wasn't, like some people say, you look at a colt's foot and it looked like a horse's hoof, and, maybe the inside of a lung because of that coating, the white coating on it. But that isn't what they were seeing at all. There is the signatures, but really, and those signatures were physical signposts, but really what they were really doing is they were paying attention. They were doing what we were talking about a few minutes ago. They were tuning, paying attention, and they did this collectively. It wasn't like there was one or two herbalists or a small group of people. People have been doing this for generations, and that collective knowledge was really their science, actually, and that's what they passed down. So whenever I hear the doctrine of signatures, I mean, there's some things that don't play true, but most of it does. And it really is because it was distilled information that was coming, passed down genetically to these people. So yeah, it's pretty neat. So let's see, the question was, how is it that I delve into plant spirit communication? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, and also just like the botanical world as a whole, because there's, personal use, there's using it with clients, family, there's actually looking at the plant, there's books, there's like, what's been the most helpful method for you?
Well, all of it adds, when you talk about knowledge and even adding to your body of information, learning from other people, learning from books, keeping up with the studies, all of that is enriching. It's all exciting. And when you love something, you kind of want to know it from all angles. So I love all that information, but that really isn't what I know. What I know is, and what is in me is really about the work I do with the plants directly. And it's embodied, it's added to by information. But that sense of knowing, that's really what I fed in myself. It was instilled in me when I was really young by the way I was taught by my grandmother. My grandmother, who was from Armenia, she was an Armenian herbalist who came here during, right after World War II. And she had had a very hard life. She was part of the Armenian genocide. And most of her family had been killed, most of my grandfather's family. And she felt very strongly, literally so, that it was her knowledge of the plants and her belief in God that saved their lives. So she meant that literally. And she taught that sense of knowing, that kind of instinctual knowledge, or that genetic knowledge. That's what she transferred to her grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I, in particular, I think gobbled it up. I think in every family, in every community, there are people that have that spark of green blood, I call it. We all come as humanity with different talents and different things that we're skilled at, that we have knacks with. And in every family, in every community, there were people who were skilled and in herbs, and it was just part of their genetic knowledge. And they were usually identified early and trained by the elders. So my grandmother actually did that for me in a sense. I don't think that she, I think if I was to have asked her, she wouldn't have known she was doing it. She was just following in that tradition. Her grandmother had done that for her, and she was passing that down. And so with that came really kind of this sense of knowing. So for me, if I have a question, I'll use this example, comfrey, in the early 70s, comfrey was one of the most popular herbs, right? And it was used in large amounts, both as a food and medicine. It was also grown in copious amounts by farmers and fed to cattle because it made the milk so rich, and it really increased the quality of milk and all of that. And it also has, as you know, an ancient history, a very strong history of being used, and there was never any issues about its safety. And then in the early 80s, it was discovered that members of its family had very strong alkaloids, paralyzing alkaloids, and actually consumption of those could kill people, and it was a pretty terrible disease. And so comfrey, all of a sudden, with many members of their family, became questioned, and people stopped using it. And there was a lot of concern, like, were we using a plant that actually had toxicity without knowing it, and we were using it in large amounts. Right. And so I did what I would recommend as responsible. I followed all the studies, I read all the research, and I was confused about it. I kept thinking, I know this herb is safe. So I did my research, I did my studies. I kind of had a sense about how those studies were done in the research. I felt like they weren't conclusive. They didn't really give a whole picture. But what I really did is I went to the plant. I just went with my question to the plant. And this is what I'm talking about, about the knowing. It's like it's great to read. It's great and sometimes people have to make choices by that kind of information, that mental information. There's probably times when I do that as well. But in this case, I just went directly to comfrey. And I really just sat there with it all afternoon. big clumps of comfrey. And remember, I've been working with it now at that point, even for almost 20 years as a
Wow.
primary in my life. So I already had a relationship. I just sat with it, and this is a clear message I got. It just went, like, just hang on there, because in a few years I'll be, clear in the clear again, and people will be using me again, and I'll be one of the popular herbs. And in the meantime, it just goes, I don't really care, because I keep growing. I'm like a weed. Nothing's going to get rid of me anyway. It was very casual about it. I got really clearly that really I could continue to use it, and I could recommend it to people who knew about the controversy, if I was responsible in sharing. And so that's kind of I couldn't put it in my formulas. I didn't put it in my teas anymore. But when there are instances where I felt it could be really helpful for somebody, and maybe more helpful than another herb, I would just explain the situation and allow them to make a choice, and tell them where they could get the information, and tell them that I did feel safe about using it. So that's kind of what I'm sharing about. That's where I would go ultimately, is to the plants. And how do you develop that kind of rapport? You start today just holding conversation in court with them, and taking care of them, and allying for them, and speaking up for them, and using them. Those are the ways that we create relationship, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I know exactly what you're talking about. That's pretty much like the foundation of the work that I do with flower essences. And so I'm curious for you to say, I went right to the plant and asked it. It makes the whole world of sense to me. And yet I wonder, like, for people who are really skeptical, like, wait, hold on, you guys are talking about going to a plant and talking to it and asking questions? Like, what do you say? That sounds kind of crazy. And yeah, so what do you say to skeptics?
Well, I don't meet very many of them anymore, actually. I think that more and more. But when I first started my work back in the 70s, I mean, everybody was a skeptic. There was a small group of like long-haired hippies that were like, yay, and they were like totally like, just like organic food and everything. But almost everybody was a skeptic, really. They weren't sure. But today you find mostly curious minds, which is really just so beautiful. It's like that childness again that wants to know, like, these are things our ancestors have been using. They still are being used around the world. I mean, there's some really strong statements you can make about the World Health Organization, which is an international organization of medical practitioners and scientists. It's a really highly regarded organization. They state that 82% of the world's population is still using herbs as a primary system. There's a lot of familiarity now, like people see teas at supermarkets. So most people are more curious. And even the really left brain people, they're often the ones who are the most hungry. And I think about how those plants really jump out at those people and kind of scare them. Like if you met both Stephen Buhner and Elliot Cowan, who are great representatives for spirit communication with plants, they're both about as left brain, really very, very intelligent people. I don't know if Stephen would consider himself left brain, but he definitely is very intellectual. And Elliot states that. And so I think that, it's like with anything, when it's good to have a healthy bit of skepticism, but people are curious. And also I never feel that I have to convince anybody of anything. This is a wonderful healing art. It's a wonderful way of living. Working with plants brings such joy and hope and beauty and healing and health to our lives. And so if somebody wants that, it's available. And if they'd rather not use it, well, then whatever gets them off, maybe football and beer, or whatever. So, you know what I'm saying? It's not like, I don't think that, I think I have been kind of a ministry of the green for most of my life, but it's really just for those people who are really interested and want to know. And so,
and how have you...
I just wanted to say one other thing about that too, and whatever, if somebody's issue is that they don't think herbs are powerful, then I just say, well, try a few grains of cayenne, the most safe, benevolent, it's a spice. And even just a few grains too much, you're going to be on fire. Your bowels are going to start ruminating and running. And, the plants are very powerful, and they'll speak to you very powerfully if you want them to. Like, they could take a little bit of tincture of kava, right? And your tongue goes numb and your body relaxes and you're start to roll on everybody.
Wow. It just makes me wonder of a question that I hadn't initially thought of, but there seems to be this trend I'm sure that you've seen in your lifetime herbalism evolve greatly. And in my generation, there seems to be this trend of people looking to plants for spirituality, but really only fixating to like a very small portion of plants, which would include the hallucinogenic plants. And there being, there being so many species of different kinds of plants, I think it's kind of a limiting viewpoint. But I wondered, if you had anything to add to that conversation of, kind of how trendy that's become.
Well, I have to first of all be confessional here. It was very trendy in my generation too.
Right.
And I think it is all, the way that young people, we go to the edge, that's part of living. And when you're young, when you're in your teens, in your 20s, it's like you're looking for powerful experiences, jumping off cliffs and out of air, there's just, so that's partly, and I think it's natural actually. But the thing with plant spirit medicine, with those strong medicines, there's a number of things that have to be considered. One is that they're not plentiful, they're rare. And also, they're also very powerful. And anything that's powerful like that is not meant to be used often. It's like the messages that you get from these kinds of plants are lifetime. You get a gift from them, and that takes a lot of contemplating, like months to sit there with it, not like every week or every few months, So people are, I think there's a certain amount of abusiveness that goes on, both because these plants are not plentiful. They are plants that live in very special habitats. They've been used by traditional peoples for centuries. And so when we see really literally at this point hordes of Americans and people from around the world seeking answers from these plants and seeking them a lot, not just once or twice or 3 or 4 times, but repeatedly, there just isn't going to be enough to supply it. But that's only one issue. The other thing is that even the common plants like nettle and dandelion and burdock and our everyday plants, they're very powerful teachers. They're just not going to go in and rearrange your mind. They're not going to make your eyes start seeing, they're not going to break the veil of our everyday existence. But those are the plants that we're actually meant to use all the time. Those plants will change us in a gradual way that's more lasting and more responsible. And I just want to praise the work of herbalists. There's one woman in particular named Carol Guyette, and also Pam Montgomery is doing this work, where they're actually working with the everyday plants, but they're going to them in the sacred way that people go to ayahuasca or peyote or marijuana for, And here I'm not talking about medicinal use of marijuana, I'm talking about using it as that, like more, well, it is medicinal, but more the spiritual or journeying aspect. So they're using what they're doing is creating this very conscious awareness, you're actually creating a ceremony around dandelion, and you take dandelion into your body the same way that you might peyote or that you might ayahuasca, and you're allowing it to travel in you. So it's not going to rearrange your molecules for you, but it's going to help you repattern in a more solid way. And if I could just draw one more analogy to that also, it's like even in healing, there are these really powerful herbs like golden seal and poke and lobelia, black cohosh and blue cohosh, and false unicorn root. And they're very, very powerful, but all of those plants are rare. They grow and ginseng is another one. They grow in very specific habitats. And these plants weren't really meant for every day. They were meant when we're seriously imbalanced. And so you use them for physical healing when you really, really need them, and you use them you're concerned about the dosage and how much you take them and for how long. So we're put on a medical protocol with these herbs. And so it's the same with those spiritual plants. There's a medical protocol or spiritual protocol that you use those plants for. But then you have these vast amount of plants that are there feeding our souls every day, feeding our molecular structure. They're safe. They are not going to dramatically change the way we are overnight. It's a gradual shift. And those are common weedy plants. And so I think the same goes for spirit. I think we have to wake up every day and learn to find spirit every day around us in the common and everyday. And that's hard. That's why people reach over here for this big blast from great spirit, the great queen of the jungle, the anaconda snake or the great peyote god. We reach for those because we're so starving for it when we really need the everyday. So I don't know if I'm making sense. There is absolutely a place. These are our holy spiritual plants, and they need to be revered, and we need to look at how traditional peoples have used them. We also need to remember when we're using them, it's like all of the other traditions that we're becoming mindful of, that we're borrowing without the respect of how these traditional peoples have cared for these plants for generations and are, they're sharing them, but not in the way that we're using them. I think we have to be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's helpful. So there's absolutely a place. I rever them too. I rever my journeys with them. They've been few and far between. I think about them for years because that's how powerful they are. I look forward to meeting them again, maybe when I'm 80 or 90. But I wouldn't really want to stay because I think it's too concentrated a dose. I think that I can get it in dandelion and self-heal and nettle. I can get it in being grateful every day and trying to find spirit in the everyday awareness. So
I love that.
I think people are doing it for spirit, they're yearning. We're so lost from that. And that just jerks you right over there really quickly, but it usually lands you right where you were. So that's my thoughts about it.
I love that. Yeah. How have you seen the world of herbalism and medicinal plants evolve in your lifetime? Like how you said from like a bunch of hippies to now.
Yeah, well, I mean, there also, I want to be clear, there were elders, there were other people for certain, but it was those young people, and it would be like the young people who are pushing, bringing the consciousness of social consciousness and social justice issues, and it's usually coming from the younger people because of that edginess we were talking about. They're living on the edge because of that. I think because it's a great place to live. It's a little dangerous out there, but it's great. You bring back so much when you're in those boundary places. And so the young people at that time, we were more like hippies, which we really were back to earth people. I would say, very interested in nature and gardening and creating good food. Those were the kinds of people. I was living out in the country. And when I think of hippies, that was what I was, I associated with people who were really concerned about the earth and what was happening and what we could do to make a difference. And I really think my generation actually made a huge difference in many ways. So how I've seen that change it's like amazing because herbs had gone very deeply underground. There were very few books available. There were really very, very few herb stores, no classes, no schools. There were a few elders who were just looking and hungry for students, people like Dr. Christopher and Norma Myers on the East Coast, on the West Coast. And maybe, I don't even think Adele was teaching I don't think she even started teaching on the East Coast until like really maybe the late 80s and 90s. So really we're talking about it had gone deeply underground. And it really wasn't because of us. It wasn't like we made this, it wasn't like there was a small group of us who went, oh, herbs, we love them. It was really something that moved through us and came out. It was almost like we didn't have a choice, And as I said, I think it was really genetically coded. And a lot of times people think it's because, there was such a need. We had such a break in healing as well. Medicine had become so, there was just, so many drugs being developed and used. And, the whole modern conventional system had become very narrow without reaching out about food. And, maybe this part of your body was connected to another. It had become very disconnected. And so there was just this hunger, I think, to kind of reconnect. And that knowledge, that green knowledge really kind of moved through us and came out, and we owned it. We said yes to it. Mm-hmm. Oh, I started to mention, we often think it's about our own need for healing, but I think that was a big part of it, the need for us to feel connected to nature again. And for many of us, it's through the green plants. It's through our relationship with plants that helps us, and animals and rocks, but the plants also have a very strong relationship with us. But I actually think it had more to do with the plants calling us home to them because they needed us to help protect their gardens and help bring them forth so they could do their work. I really think that it was a very co-creative relationship with the plants in charge. We thought we were in charge, but really, especially as time goes on and I watch how they move through communities and how people are just standing there and they go, well, I'm interested. And then all of a sudden the plants come at them full force. So I think the plants have an agenda with us, and that, when we serve them our lives, which, by the way, to just interpret that when we work with them, and maybe for some of us serving them as writing flower power books and working with flower essences, and some it's holding conferences and making medicines and teaching. So however it is that we're serving them, how we're working with them, they are guiding us actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah. So on a practical thing, what we've seen in a very few short years, it's been a little over 40 years, we've seen a tremendous amount of really good herb books. In fact, I was just talking to my publisher the other day, and I was saying that, really when I look at some of the gifts that our whole generations, I'm talking about the younger and the older people here, what this age of herbalism will leave is herbal classics, books that I think will, outlast us and become classics. I would especially say some of the younger herbalists are writing brilliant books right now. So we went from like 5 or 6 or maybe 8 at the most books to like can't even keep up with the number of really good books. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I actually am one of those people. I don't think that you can write too much about anything so long as you're offering your own experience and, your own way of seeing. And then we've also seen schools. I mean, there's just schools almost all across the country now. The first school that kind of reemerged was the California School of Herbal Studies. There was also a school in Canada, the Dominion College, that by Ella Burnsnick, who had been going for a long time. She was an elder, and her daughter continued that school for years. So that school was going. But really now, I mean, we have beautiful, incredible herb schools here in Vermont and all along the East Coast and down into Florida and then all across the country. So, and conferences, which are, to me, are like just the enormous family gatherings. I mean, and, young people are going, guess what? I could make a career. I could do herbs and actually, make that my livelihood and career. So we have seen a tremendous change. And then even, I want to say this, and it's a bold statement I know to make, but I don't make it lightly. I've thought about it. I think that we have impacted the healthcare system more than we know, because really when you look back, and it's not just the herbalists, but it's acupuncturists and, this whole holistic movement, I feel that we've helped to bring care back into the healthcare system, where modern medicine, which is a tremendous system of healing, but anything when it's just the soul rainer sometimes gets out of hand, and it had forgotten its place in the whole healing mandala. It had forgotten that it's just one aspect of healing, and that you do need spiritual healing and you need herbal healing and you need all of that plays a really good part. So I feel that herbalism has played a huge part in helping empower people to know what they need and what they don't, and that they actually can make choices, and that there are other types of healing that are appropriate. So really, I think on so many levels, and I could go on, like even just, people who use herbs, like they, you see herbal in spas now, you see herbal spas, and you see people adding herbs to bathwater and all the flower essences. And I really think we've had a big impact, and I think it's been mostly a really healthy impact. There have been side effects to it that I think we have to grow up and approach and be aware of. But all in all, I think it's wonderful that herbalism is available for people if they want it.
When you talk about the side effects, what are you referring to?
Well, I think one of the most obvious is that we have to really address where all of these bountiful plants that are coming that people are using in their essential oils. I mean, I think the essential oil company is lagging as far as ecological and environmental concerns are. And I love aromatherapy, by the way, so I think it's a beautiful field. But, every time I walk into these big stores now, department stores and grocery stores, and you see these little bottles of aromatherapy, people are so proud of how many tonnage it takes to make just a little bit of oil. But the very first question is this plant coming from the wild? If it is, it's completely not sustainable. There's just no way that wild plants can sustain that kind of popularity. And so I think the essential oil company has to really step in and address this. They are addressing it, but it's really hard to give up things like frankincense and rosewood and spikenard and, the perfume company. They don't want to, these are, and sandalwood. I mean, really. Now there are good forms or organic cultivation of it, but people have to be willing to pay that extra amount for that. So yeah, these are those issues. And then there's also, the other thing that just happens as things get big, I'm not sure that they're negative. I just think we have to mature enough to know how to embrace it all. Is that when herbalism, when it first began, it was a smaller community. You sort of knew all the faces, and it wasn't like everybody got along, but we all loved each other. We argued with love. And today I see it's become such a huge circle. It's not really a community anymore. It's communities upon communities and circles upon circles. And the common goal is usually a love of, so long as you can keep that love of plants as the center, the matrix. So long as it all goes back to that, I think we'll find our way well. But sometimes it's frankly hurts me, and it's embarrassing to watch the communication that happens where people are It's mostly through internet. It's, you know, the way people communicate when they disagree and they have disagreements. I think people haven't matured enough to know how to communicate on this new tool. It's a young tool and people don't see each other. So you can say really good things, but when you really say really good things in really bad ways, then it becomes more personal and people forget what the issue is. And if we can remember what the issue is, then we're all working together, because it's like healing. It's like we're talking about the modalities of healing. And once you realize the main thing is to help somebody, it's not who's right. It's not that I know more than you. It's really what's best for this person. In this case, what's best for the plants. So that's another thing I've seen, is just finding a way that we can, I think it's about being kind and bringing the goodness forth in the communication and the respect of all the different ways that we practice. Yeah.
Wow. I love that. I noticed, out of all the books you've written, it seems like one of the more recent ones is this beautiful recipe book that has all of the like really easy, simple recipes. And I'm just wondering, like, for the average person, so you're talking about like the herbalism community and the circles upon circles. And,
Yes.
For the average person, they may not have access into those circles yet. And so, living a really busy lifestyle, wondering if you have any like, tips that you could offer for like, how do you bring some of that magic of the plants into your world? If it's like, a simple tea recipe, or like what's a good, tincture, or, what are some of the ways that we can sort of, in terms of life hacks, make bringing plants into our everyday lives really simple?
Yeah, well, that's what I wrote that book for. Actually, it's called Medicinal Herbs: A Beginner's Guide. It is very,
Yes.
very simple approach that is about how to bring them in every day. I think probably the common way that people do it is through cooking. Really, I think that's one of the most magical ways, is to have your spices and your herbs, and then just to do a little bit of research into how medicinal everyone and how ancient every single one of those spices are. Like, I always like to remind people that every one of the spices and the herbs in your spice cabinet and you use in culinary, in your cooking, are some of the most powerful herbs. And that's why they were introduced into the households. They were used because they were antivirals. They help with infections. They had antimicrobial properties. They were good for digestion. They helped to digest fat. We've forgotten all that. And our taste buds have become so familiar through thousands of years of using them that we just associate the flavors with certain foods. But there was a reason why our ancestors used those, every single one. So that in itself is fascinating. And it's not like a complicated thing. You just pick up a book like that book I wrote has a lot of the common culinary herbs. And really the only difference that makes it a difference between, I'm going to just sprinkle a little rosemary on my chicken or tofu or whatever into a medicine where I'm taking it for my brain health or as an antioxidant, is in dosage and frequency. So when we put it just a little sprinkle in our food, it's for flavor. But when I make a tea with that, or when I take a tincture with that for my brain health, then that's the difference right there. It's dosage and frequency. So that's one way. I always say to people, if you cook with herbs, you're already a practicing herbalist, because you're practicing herbs. You're working with plants. And I know that makes a light of that title, but really, herbalism isn't just about medicine. It's about health and well-being in every day. And for me, the definition of a herbalist is somebody who works with and loves plants. And then I define it. I take it down and say, well, you are a clinical herbalist, or you're a family herbalist. So I'm a family and community practitioner, practicing herbs every day in my family and in my community. So cooking is one. And then also, really, I think the fine art of making tea. I'm really pleased to see tea drinking become acceptable again. People are drinking tea, not as much as they're drinking coffee by any means, but, just getting a couple of good tasting teas that maybe are relaxing. Maybe when you come home from work, instead of going for the wine or beer, you'd make yourself a chamomile, lemon balm, lavender tea, for instance. Or if the world just seems a little weighty for you right now, a really uplifting tea. It's one of my favorite teas. I drink it a lot, is lemon balm and hawthorn, a little oats, and a little St. John's wort in it. Just a really simple blend. Oats, lemon balm, hawthorn, St. John's wort. But drinking that tea, 1 or 2 cups of tea in the evening, you could sweeten it with honey. you start to feel after a few days, you actually start to feel stronger in spirit. You start to feel like you can deal with what's going on, because those herbs all embrace and lift us up.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you wanted to keep it really simple, just drink lemon balm. Lemon balm is the lifter of the spirits, So that's another thing, is bringing tea in. And then there's so many ways. I mean, like for people who say, well, I don't know, I don't want to drink tea, just make a big pot of rosemary or chamomile and soak your feet in it when you're watching TV or reading a book. And especially in the evening time, it's so just decompressing. So there's so many simple ways. And if nothing else, just make sure that you have lots of potted herbs and plants around you,
Yeah.
Grow them. Like I can see in your house, there's like all these beautiful plants, and they're recharging the air, they're filling your space with chlorophyll, they're reminding you of their ancientness and their connection to the jungle, because those look like South American plants, so even just on that level, there's great ways.
Yeah. And, I think in terms of like the average, probably we have a lot of people listening to this podcast who know a great deal about botanicals and herbs, but for those who don't, I think there's there may be a lack of awareness about herbs that are used to really, impact some specific condition in the body versus, say, like the more like nutritive tonic herbs. And I wondered if you could, in terms of like teas, for example, talk about what are the nutritives and the tonics that you see that could be so helpful for people to be able to consume regularly to, boost their wellness.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because they're my favorite group of herbs. So to me, the superior medicine, and that's a term actually used in traditional Chinese medicine for this group of herbs. And in Ayurvedic medicine, they're called rasanas, or rejuvenators. And in Western medicine, they're called tonics. And so there's this big group of herbs that there's many different names for them, but they're tonics, they're nourishing, or they're adaptogens. They help our bodies adapt to the stresses of modern day life. And those herbs are generally the herbs that have a huge safety net. They usually don't have toxicity or side effects, other than the side effect of feeling better. They were meant to be used on a regular basis. That doesn't mean necessarily every day, but you can. And they usually are very rejuvenating to the system. And they're oftentimes used as a foundation for protocols. So they're not specific for particular problems necessarily, but they provide the building blocks that help our bodies be able to deal with specific problems. And I'm going to say this very generally. Of course, each one of these herbs you'd want to research, or you'd want to talk to a good healthcare practitioner for. Most of the time, these herbs are generally considered safe to use with allopathic or different types of medicine, because they're not necessarily medicinal plants. So, and some of those herbs in this group and these are all of our common plants, by the way. None of these plants are the at-risk or endangered plants, which I think is also very interesting, and kind of leads into that little discussion we were having earlier about this different levels of spirit that we feed. So herbs that fit into this category, one of my very favorites is nettle. Nettle is also a medicinal plant, but it's primarily a food. It can be used as a food and eaten every day, made into tea. I know people who aren't used to herbs, they say, how in the world do you eat nettle? Because nettle has formic acid in it that creates big welts. But when you dry nettle or when you steam nettle, that formic acid is released and it's no longer active. And so you can then safely use it. And nettle has a long history of being used as a food throughout all of the Mediterranean and Eastern and Western European countries. Around many places of the world, nettle was considered a food. Mm-hmm. Our early ancestors used it. It's very, very delicious once it's steamed. I think it's far superior than spinach and far more nutritious, by the way. So you have an extremely nourishing, revitalizing, inexpensive, and ecologically sound plant to harvest. Everybody should eat nettle.
Oh yeah. Have you heard about the Milarepa, who was a yogi in the caves in the Himalayas, and he basically was so far up there and was doing solitary retreat for so many years that he just like survived for years and years and years on nettles. And it is said that his skin had sort of a tinge of green because he ate so many nettles.
I could say that there's been times that I've turned green a little too. Mostly mine was from comfrey and nettle and yeah, so nettle is a great one. It's commonly available. Dandelion is another one. And so, everybody kind of just passes over dandelion, but I always like to remind people that in most parts of the world, dandelion is considered a very potent medicine and food. And so here again, you have a crossover. You have a plant that you could steam the leaves, They're a bitter green, so they stimulate digestion. They're good for your liver. They're good for your urinary system. So they do have medicinal properties, but they're safe enough to be used as a food. And then the root is just a superior liver tonic. And it's a bitter again. So you're never going to sit down to your family and go, here's a big pot of roasted dandelion roots or a pot of steamed greens of of dandelion, but you can easily mix them in with your other greens, and you can chop a little dandelion into your carrots because they're so nutritively concentrated, so concentrated nutrition. You don't need to sit down with big bowls of them. A little bit is going to go a long ways. And so again, you have this superior tonic and wonderful plant. And then, on another level, when you look at dandelion and nettle both, but dandelion is a real feature in this, it's extremely tenacious. So it can be dug up, it can be sprayed, it's had so much fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, it will still come back in abundance. It's basically winning the war against weed, right? I would say, a lot of times it'll come back after the ortho attacks, and it'll be like a three-headed, a little dizzy, but it will always come back with this shiny, bright flower, shining beautifully, radiant to be alive. And so on another level, just for tenacity, I would say, if you're finding it hard to root in, you're finding it hard to stay grounded, dandelion is a good herb for you, both physiologically, but also on those other levels. It's really great. So dandelion is a great one. It has no counterindications. Nettle has some, a counterindication would be you don't want to pick it fresh because you can get stung by it unless you know what you're doing. And you definitely have to make sure it's been steamed or dried before taking it internally, or you can get a bad rash from it. Otherwise, it's very acceptable for just about everybody. And then yarrow is not so much of a tonic, it's more of a common medicine. But another herb that I love, and this one here is not one that grows commonly, you don't find a lot of it. It does grow in Vermont, it's a native to Vermont, but mostly you find it growing high in mountainous regions. And it's an adaptogen that I feel is so great for people today. It's called rhodiola. I have to be quite honest, I was very concerned when rhodiola kind of hit the big popular, became cover girl. Because my first concern is if it's growing in the Himalayas and it's been used by these people for literally hundreds of years and it's an adaptogen, how much do they really have to harvest and send out?
Right.
But it is actually almost all of it is coming from cultivated sources, mostly from Mongolia. It's grown pretty sustainably, but there are now American growers who are growing it. It's available by American farmers, so that's a good thing. But I like to recommend it because it is a really incredible adaptogen for a lot of people who have long-term fatigue from just holding too much grief or not feeding and nourishing themselves enough. And not that you want to lean to an herb to do that, but when you're trying to recreate habits and you're trying to restore endocrine imbalance and endocrine health, this is just a great herb. If people are trying to stay away from stimulants so much, this is a good herb because it doesn't have caffeine in it. It's not a stimulant, it's an activator to the system. So that's another one that's really good. What are your favorite ones?
Oof. I'm so immersed in the flower essence world. Let's see, the herbs.
Lemon balm is another one that
lemon balm, yeah.
Yeah, lemon balm is another one that it is very popular and people love it because it tastes so good, like lemon balm tea just by itself. You don't have to blend it with anything. Just by itself, it's so relaxing and sweet. It just tastes so good to drink, but it's a very powerful antiviral. It's also really good for the nervous system. Used over a period of time, 2 or 3 weeks, it really helps people feel grounded and in themselves. It kind of helps you feel empowered again. There is a counterindication. It's not recommended for people with low thyroid. You'd have to take a lot of it, but you don't want to use it on a regular regime or for people who have low thyroid issues. It is recommended for people with high thyroid, but not low. So lemon balm is another one.
I love the warming. I tend towards cold, even though I'm living in Phoenix. So I love the gingers and the turmerics and cayenne and one that's not necessarily warming, but oat straw, the soothing.
Oat straw is another great one. Yeah. So those are two different groups because the warming ones like ginger and cayenne and cinnamon is another one that's just wonderful. All of those are those culinaries that we're talking about, very powerful medicines. And every single one of those if you were to look at, say, the top 20 medicines that are used, those are all up there. Turmeric is another one, of course, again, very popular right now. And then oat straw, which are or the milky green oat tops, that's a mucilage. It's very soothing. And it also has very wonderful tonic properties that are very nourishing and good for the nervous system. So yeah, they're great. Those are great ones too. I love those herbs. And partly why I love those, and we'll put horseradish and garlic in that group too.
Oh,
Partly
definitely.
why I love those herbs is because they're common. You can just buy them at the farmer's market or a supermarket. They're not costly. You can grow them easily. And then they're used for multitude of situations. So like garlic, if you just feel a little run down, you feel a little run down as far as your immune system, and you feel a little prone to colds and flus, there's your poor man's penicillin. That's its common name. And you can chop it up and cook it. You can make fire cider. It's a great recipe using all of those herbs that we just mentioned. It's a very warming, fiery formula that's really good at keeping bugs and flus at bay and easy to make. Yeah, so those are all great ones.
What would you recommend this is kind of a twofold question for somebody who lives a really busy lifestyle. They have a lot of stress. They just need a little bit of support, maybe adaptogenic support to help take the edge off of some of that really high stress. And then what if they say, Rosemary, I don't have time to make teas? Would you recommend a tincture? What would you recommend?
I'm laughing when you're describing that person. I'm thinking, who isn't that person these days?
Right.
It describes a huge part of our population, which is why I think there is so much agitation between people. People are just worn out and tired from much. It's excess. We live in such an excess culture. Yeah, so teas are only one way. There's so many quote unquote delivery systems for how to give herbs, and some formulas or some preparations might be better than others. Like for example, we would say tinctures are very concentrated. They go into the bloodstream really quickly, and they're really good for acute situations. And teas work very gradually on the system. They kind of embrace the whole body, and they help change happen more slowly. But the truth of the matter is that the best remedy is not going to work unless a person's willing to take it. So really the best delivery system is how that person will take it. So if a person isn't going to drink 3 cups of an adaptogen tea a day, tincture or capsules is a fine way. So, most herbalists will agree that tinctures, especially alcoholic tinctures, so vinegar tinctures and glycerin tinctures, will work if a person is opposed to using alcohol. So most of us will agree that they're fast working. They go into your bloodstream quickly. You don't have to do a lot of preparation, and they're very concentrated. But teas help to change your lifestyle. They help you pay attention and be aware. They actually slow you down in the process of making them, which is, for many of us, it's important in our healing process.
What do you think about boiling a cup of hot water and then putting a dropper full of tincture in there? If people were just like, I don't have time to make the bulk herb teas.
I think it's always good, especially for people who are new to herbs, not to take tinctures straight, both for your body and your taste buds, because they're so potent. So I always think it's good to dilute. So that's one way you can just add tinctures. But, there's a lot of herb companies now that are doing these little tea shots. I have a good friend, Dawn, and her husband, and they started a company where it's powdered herbs that you just stir into hot water. And I have a couple blends that are like that. They're just powdered herbs. Sometimes they don't dissolve completely. You have to stir them a little bit, but that's okay. You just take a spoon. You just add your, quarter teaspoon to a cup of hot water. It couldn't be simpler. And another nice way to do it is to take your powdered herbs and mix them with honey and a little cinnamon and ginger, or cardamom or coriander, these nice flavored culinaries that are spices that just add such a wonderful flavor. And you actually make like an instant tea. And now you have this little honey spoon. You can just add that and stir it right in, and you have a delicious drink. Or you can just eat that right off the spoon if you make it good enough. So there's really a lot of wonderful ways. And there's also syrups, which, we would argue, well, syrups have a lot of sugar in them or a lot of honey, but syrups also are fabulous for children and older people, and also for a population who, once their medicine, they've been trained that their medicine should taste sweet and shouldn't be bitter and awful tasting. Syrups are another great way. I mean, think about elderberry syrup, I think elderberry syrup is like echinacea. They're the great diplomats of the herbal industry, right? Or the herbal. They made herbalism acceptable for everybody. Those two herbs, they're great combined. In fact, I just made an elderberry, whole plant echinacea elderberry tincture. I'm really excited.
Yum. Oof, delicious. Yum. Yeah. So one last question, and that is there any advice you could give about mindful awareness and being aware of the herbs that you do consume.
Mm.
Because in terms of talking about plants as teachers, I feel like they're so forgiving, whether, I've used them with myself or my dog, in terms of, you might try the same thing with pharmaceuticals and they're not as forgiving. But with herbs, it's sort of like you can experiment a little bit. You can take some, you can take it every day. Then maybe you feel like, oh, I'm a little too warm. Maybe I'll back off. Like what kind of, hints could you offer about having mindful awareness about whether, knowing whether something is appropriate for us or not?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So mindful awareness, I love that. And I got several things just came flooding through when you were saying that. One is that, if we can bring mindful awareness to everything we do in life, it makes life so much more delicious. So on that level, like even just eating an orange, there's lots of times I just peel an orange and put it in my mouth, and sometimes it's gone before I hate to say this, before I even realize I had all this delicious. And if I just but the difference in experience of just an orange, if I peel it and I smell the rind and then I put a piece in my mouth, and it changes my whole experience of being alive. Just that, it's like really appreciate. And it's not that life is always delicious by any means, but there is a lot of deliciousness in it. And so with herbs, there's a number of things that happen when we slow down and we put a taste of the tincture or a taste of the syrup, or more ideally, a taste of the tea in our mouth, and we hold that. And we just let that feel in our mouths, the taste, all the different taste buds ruminating over the flavor of that. And then we slowly let it go down our bodies. A number of things happen then as the plant, we're receiving the plant. And it's like communion. You take that in, and it's not just a wafer or a sip of grape juice anymore. It's the body of life coming into you, right?
Right.
So there's that. On a whole different level for our practical listeners, I think that was very practical, by the way, but for those people on a whole nother level, in our mouths, through our taste buds, our sense of taste and smell, we are able to perceive most of the chemical constituents and the actions of the plants through our sensory beings. It's called organoleptic testing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually almost as accurate, and in some ways more accurate, than all of the high tech testing that they do to determine the qualities. So we allow that taste to come into our mouth. And to put it in practical terms, let's say that we're taking chamomile in, and we made a strong cup of chamomile, and we let that come in. We taste a sweetness, we taste a bitterness, we taste a layer of astringency, and then a softening. And all of that is telling us the actions of the plant, where it's letting us know the major constituents, actually truly the major chemical constituents, and then the actions that they have. And we don't learn that right off, but as we begin this process of experiencing these herbs and tasting life, we begin to understand the properties that it's giving us. And it's a way of perceiving. So with my students, it's an exercise, like when let's say we're doing our nervings, the teas for the nervous system. Mm-hmm. I make up 10 quart jars. We have these little tiny tasting cups, and we pour it in, and we pass they're little Chinese glass tasting cups. They're really beautiful. We pass them around in a tea, and everybody has them. And then this group of 30 people, we take our tea at the same time. We hold it in our mouth, and we let it go down. And then we can all share together this kind of unified experience. Oh, this tasted bitter. This tasted sour. This felt soothing. This felt agitating, And so you begin to discern consciously, really. I think we pick it up anyway, but it's unconscious. And we can live an entirely unconscious life. People do all the time. I think people are all born consciously, but at some point, oftentimes that changes, usually from so much pain and hardship. But if once we decide that we want to live a conscious life, it makes everything that we're experiencing come in this way that we're really perceiving for their own, this being that we are, that is a sense organ of the earth, that's perceiving all its joy and its sorrow and the laughter and the tears, and we perceive that. So that we can have that through the plants. We can experience that kind of depth to that conscious awareness when we take the plants in. So it makes every orange, every chamomile, every dandelion that we eat just a sensory experience. And then you get that smile that you get this. So I have to say this about the herbal community that I know, this huge group of people, is, to me, when I meet them, they turn me on because they're so turned on by life. And part of it is this very thing that we're speaking of, right? Mm-hmm. They immerse themselves in the beauty of the green world. With a purpose, they move forward. they experience with conscious awareness the plants as they come in, and those plants transform us, I think. It's magic.
It's pure magic. And it's
Even if we're not aware it's happening for
right.
us. We can turn it into awareness. It makes it so much better.
Right. Wow. Such a pleasure to talk to you, Rosemary. It's just, you are pure magic. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours. I wanted to make sure that I reiterated that you have all of these incredible books that people can tap into your wisdom with. Medicinal Herbs, A Beginner's Guide, which is her most recent book, which is fabulous. It's just chock full with all these incredible, yummy recipes. Herbal Healing for Women has been just like a mainstay in my own life, and self-care and caring for women friends, and all the other 9 books that she wrote. So I would definitely, go on Amazon and take your pick. And is there anything else that you want to share? Your website, Rosemary, where people can continue to learn from you?
Yeah, they could just go to www.sagemountain.com. Yeah. And, the wonderful, beautiful thing is that in every community now, there are herbalists sprouting up. So people can find plant lovers, It's a really wonderful thing. I just want to encourage all your listeners to, just explore it, because for so many of us, it helps to open our hearts to a greater way of being on the planet, really. In a time that's a little challenging for people. This can be such a wonderful lifeline and joy. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everything you've brought to this world, Rosemary. Really, really deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to The Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.